Nearly everyone at some point in their life is going to inevitably experience some sort of crisis. Now, that can look like something different depending on the individual. It may be a genuinely gut-wrenching tragedy that sends you into a spiral of misery, which to an extent is quite understandable and congruent with the situation. Alternatively, it could be an extremely impulsive, deleterious decision you've made that has carried with it severely unpleasant and dire consequences with which you struggle to contend. Or it could also be an event that most people would dismiss as trivial, but you responded extremely disproportionately, it set you off emotionally, and once you try to reason through it, you're not quite certain why that was the case. Now, for many people, these crises can evoke reflection and subsequent growth. They're sort of blessings in disguise, so to speak. But for others, they can evoke hopelessness because you think back to how you felt as that crisis was unfolding and you felt hopeless, and you ask yourself, well, when life happens again, and such a crisis inevitably unravels again, then I'm going to feel hopeless again. I said again a lot, but I think my point was illustrated quite well. My name is Ethan, and welcome to my channel, Finding What Works. I have been in some form of therapeutic treatment for a pretty lengthy period of time at this point. Now, the specific technique, practitioner, the length of time under which I was in their care, that varies substantially. In fact, I've been a participant in that more standard conventional talk therapy that you might see depicted in media where you just sort of sit there and vent. More recently, I've been a patient in DBT, which is quite a stark contrast to that, right? It's quite structured and present-oriented and interested in implementing concrete steps in order to improve your life. And I've also spent a lot of time on YouTube searching for self-help material from licensed professionals, which interestingly has been a lot more helpful than I had initially anticipated. And my goal with this channel is to select certain elements from each form of treatment that have worked for me. Now, that might mean that I can concretely explain the ways in which they've benefited me, or it could also mean in a more abstract sense that they've evoked something, an emotional, visceral reaction that has resonated with me strongly, and I could sort of talk through that with you. For today's video, I want to talk about a skill from dialectical behavior therapy entitled the chain analysis. There are two primary reasons I thought that this would make compelling subject matter for my first video. The first one is because it's quite pertinent to my present treatment. In fact, two of the previous sessions I've had with my individual DBT therapist have consisted either overwhelmingly or entirely of the two of us either constructing a chain analysis or me constructing one as homework and us discussing it and delving into it during the session. So there's an element of relevance there. And additionally, this is a skill that I have sort of mixed feelings on. There are certain elements that I find genuinely beneficial to a borderline unparalleled extent, and at the same time, there are certain aspects of it that I might not necessarily dismiss entirely, but feel compelled to tweak or modify in order to better suit my treatment. So having mixed sentiments on this skill, I think, is quite interesting, especially for the Finding What Works theme of this channel. So what is a chain analysis? What purpose does it serve? And what specific steps do I need to undertake in order to constructively compose one? Well, first of all, the purpose of a chain analysis is for you to sort of retroactively gain insight into why you spiraled into a mental health crisis or engaged in a certain detrimental behavior. The way it accomplishes this is by breaking down this overarching, broad, monstrous in scope, distressing event into a series of more palatable parts. It deconstructs it to make it easier to digest, understand, and then hopefully by the end, modify your behavior in the future in a more productive manner. So the first step of completing a chain analysis is to identify what Marsha Linehan, the sort of founder of DBT, has dubbed the problem behavior. Now, there's something a bit ironic about this because I personally am not too fond of the term problem behavior. And I say that that's ironic because the first skill to which I was introduced in DBT in a group setting was one called the non-judgmental stance, which the title of the skill sort of speaks for itself. And I do find that labeling a certain deleterious or harmful behavior as problematic can be a bit too judgmental, especially when you're already beating yourself up over it. You know, you don't really need to consider yourself or certain actions that have appeared as recurring patterns as problems. So if you want to be less judgmental, I know this is a bit of semantics, but it's deeply important to me being interested in the English language and all of that. You can label it harmful or destructive behavior. And you take this specific act, you identify it, and sometimes it's not so black and white. Oftentimes it will be. It will be a specific action, an impulse or urge you gave into, or an otherwise harmful behavior in which you engaged without perhaps thinking of the long-term ramifications. Sometimes it's a little bit nuanced. It could also be a thought. So, for example, if you have a tendency to engage in extremely self-deprecating narratives, maybe don't label the harmful behavior as the thought itself, because that's not something you have a whole lot of agency over if something merely crosses your mind. But perhaps you made a choice to entertain that narrative, to allow it to linger and fester and blow itself out of proportion. And that's where the element of choice came in. So it could either be a behavior, a thought, or something else like a body sensation that you allowed to stick around for longer than necessary. Then you pinpoint what the prompting event was. And I'm using air quotes for that because that's the specific verbiage that Linehan uses. This can be an event that would have been profoundly unpleasant regardless of the circumstances. In life, we inevitably encounter these tragedies, and no matter how well-equipped we believe ourselves to be, they will provoke some degree of distress. Alternatively, it can be an event that maybe if you weren't doing quite as unpleasantly emotionally, you would have dismissed as trivial, and you responded to it in a very visceral and disproportionate manner, and you're not quite certain why. Then you describe the factors that made you vulnerable. Now, this is pretty all-encompassing because it can refer to something quite mild. Did you get 6 hours of sleep when 8 is optimal for you? And do you find yourself susceptible to feeling poorly and unpleasantly emotionally when you don't receive sufficient sleep? Is that something you're very sensitive to? I know I certainly am. Or it can be something more intense, more severe. For instance, if someone issued a particularly scathing criticism for you, perhaps you're accustomed to those from childhood, and that sort of prompted a trauma, a deeply hurtful and agonizing one to resurface. So it's an extremely broad spectrum, and it's sort of up to you to select from all ends of the spectrum. You know, you can't understate the importance of maybe having eaten too much or eaten unhealthy food that day. And at the same time, of course, you have to take into consideration those more significant factors. And then what you do is you document what Linehan titles the chain of events that precipitated in between the prompting event, so what provoked you, and the harmful behavior you chose to engage in. In other words, it helps to think of these as the sort of shorter term consequences. And like the vulnerability aspect, this encompasses a pretty wide variety of things. It can be actions, specific choices you made in which you were an active participant. It can also be body sensations. Did you feel your shoulders tense up, your jaw tense, your legs shake, your chest sink? Pay attention to those as well. Those are important and they are often overlooked. It can also be thoughts and cognitions that arose. What did you tell yourself about the way you handled the situation What did you tell yourself about yourself? Maybe the prompting event was a failure that stung you, and then you made the choice to entertain certain thoughts about what that dictates about your self-worth, even though said thoughts may not necessarily be accurate. And which events occurred in tandem with, or as a byproduct of that sort of central prompting event. And of course, your feelings. How did you feel as a result? Label these primary emotions, because oftentimes when people describe how they're feeling, they might be awfully vague. I'm feeling upset. I feel bad. That's a particular one that DBT discourages, and for good reason. Were you angry? Were you sad? Were you disgusted? Labeling the primary emotions and subsequent secondary and tertiary emotions can be quite helpful, because again, these are very rudimentary things that allow us to gain insight into how we respond to certain adverse events that we often overlook because we dismiss as so basic, so rudimentary. Then you ask yourself about the consequences that occurred in the longer term, long after you engaged in that harmful behavior. Be honest with yourself and ask, how did you, in a detrimental manner, affect yourself and/or others? The distinction between this and the previous step is that this encourages you to focus more on the longer term consequences as opposed to the shorter term ones. Then what you do is return to that chain of events, those shorter term consequences. And you list for each consequence, for each action, body sensation, cognition, consequent event, and feeling, you list more skillful behaviors you could have engaged in. So you're attempting to respond to the prompting event in a more skillful and constructive manner, because although you may not be able to avoid those unpleasant shorter-term consequences, you can respond to them in a manner such that those even more agonizing and despair-inducing long-term consequences don't occur. You're able to avoid them. You're able to avoid that grand catastrophe. And sure, you're stuck feeling unpleasantly, but who isn't from time to time? With this portion of the chain, it is paramount that you list specific skills you're going to employ in order to make these responses, these more constructive responses, a reality. For example, if you're feeling depressed and you have a tendency to be more sedentary when you're depressed, it's not quite enough to tell yourself, okay, well, I'm just going to go to the gym. That can be quite challenging for you if you have already developed and reinforced that habit of being sedentary. What specific skills are you going to utilize to get yourself in the gym, even when you might not want to, because it's beneficial for you in the long term? So be mindful of how you're going to go about doing this in the future, rather than simply telling yourself that you're going to and issuing these empty promises. Now, you take yourself back to the time before the prompting event occurred, and you ask yourself how you could better manage these factors that made you vulnerable. So you assess those vulnerabilities and you ask yourself, can I eliminate them? If I didn't get enough sleep, can I take certain actions to improve my sleep hygiene? Now, sometimes you can't eliminate them entirely, so what you can is you reduce their severity. So with the other example I stated, I don't know how many minutes ago, about a certain form of criticism provoking trauma to resurface, maybe you can't eliminate the trauma entirely. You can't just get over it like a hurdle to be conquered, but you can receive treatment for it, and that'll lessen the severity of your response. And here's where you conclude. Now that those deleterious events have unfolded, what is your plan to repair the harm that is precipitated? So this is sort of twofold. First of all, you perform damage control for the specific crisis that unfolded and the consequences that occurred as a result of your harmful behavior. You apologize to the people you hurt, for instance. Essentially take steps to repair that particular scenario, and at the same time, you also work on yourself in the longer term to prevent or reduce rather the likelihood of you engaging in those harmful behaviors in the future. So it's both specific to that crisis and universal in the sense that you don't want these harmful behaviors to become recurring. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my personal sentiments surrounding the chain analysis skills. As I prefaced in this video, they are mixed. So let's start with the aspects of it that I find most beneficial, the ones that have truly and meaningfully helped me. So when you compose this chain, or at least in my case, it encourages me to take these very crisis-oriented and high-distress situations and make them feel a lot less daunting. So oftentimes I'll feel that when my actions or thoughts or emotions spiral out of control, I feel helpless. It evokes those feelings of helplessness I was speaking about initially. I definitely fall into that camp rather than utilizing these adverse events to engage in reflection or subsequent growth. And the reason behind that is because the suffering sort of blends together and grow, like it just feels insurmountable, monstrous, gigantic in proportion. And that prompts me to believe that there wasn't anything I could have done in response. So the chain breaks this crisis of immense proportions into smaller and more manageable steps. If I assess portions of it, I'm more likely to feel less intimidated by the event rather than sort of taking a broad, overarching snapshot of what occurred. Also, in a more basic sense, there's something empowering about having the capacity to write down what caused you distress. It takes away the power that source of distress holds over you, at least in my case. You often hear this sentiment expressed in horror films. The scariest ones are the ones that avoid showing you the monster because there's something uniquely mortifying about the unseen, the thing that's so horrific that it becomes unspeakable. And simply writing it, articulating it, putting into basic words takes away from that power it holds over you, at least in my case. And I also enjoy writing, so there's also an element of passion associated with it. Also, the skill helps me feel like I have more control and agency over my life choices, even in the middle of these extremely tumultuous circumstances. What it does is it reinforces this idea of cause and effect, which many of you, including myself, learned in elementary school, right? It's a basic premise. What you do has consequences. But we often lose sight of that because the event was so distressing, so horrific, at least from our perception, that we feel like we lost agency over it. We lost that ability to orchestrate the effects, the consequences that occurred to us. But once I reason through it, I arrive at the conclusion that harmful consequences occurred, very simply, because I approached the prompting event in an impulsive or destructive manner. And at the same time, that means that if I make choices to be more skillful in response to said event, said adverse situation, it can mitigate the unpleasant consequences, and even if we're being a bit optimistic, produce more pleasant ones. I also really love this about the chain analysis. Out of all the DBT skills to which I've been exposed, the chain analysis places the most amount of emphasis on delving into the past and understanding why you behaved in such a detrimental manner. DBT tends to be extraordinarily focused on the present and the progress, the specific steps you can implement in order to cultivate a brighter future for yourself. So it's refreshing to, from time to time, look at the past and utilize that as a means of informing the decisions you make presently. Also, it's often been the case that when I've completed these chains, whether they've been on my own time or with the help of my therapist, I end up feeling validated. Sometimes it'll be the case that I come into a session and I regale a crisis I've suffered through. And I conduct myself in this overly apologetic way in front of my therapist. I'll say, oh, I didn't conduct myself in a skillful manner. I could have done this, that, and the other. And I apologize for that. I feel a sense of guilt because I'm not incorporating what you taught me into my everyday life. What ends up happening is we chain the events, we assess them in a detailed manner, and both of us, both myself and my therapist, discover that I was a lot more skillful and productive than I gave myself credit for. And that as unpleasant and distressing as the prompting event was, it could have been a lot more catastrophic when in reality it was moderately or even severely unpleasant, albeit not to the extent to which it might have been prior to me having received treatment. Now, there are also things about the chain analysis that don't quite resonate with me. And as I said earlier, these aren't things that I sort of toss to the side entirely. These are things that I modify in my own treatment because I find that they're more applicable to me, and they might be to you as well. So one thing that sometimes baffles me or serves as a point of contention with this skill is the whole idea of a prompting event. In fact, sometimes I find it to be reductive. Sometimes I'll complete the chain and I'll notice that there wasn't really a prompting event. Sometimes the vulnerabilities themselves are the prompting event. I'm sure you've experienced this, these little variables that pile up and push you to your breaking point. It's not like a tragedy occurred and sent you spiraling. Sometimes you didn't get sleep, you didn't eat well, you're stressed, you're not coping well with said stress. All these variables, it's so multifaceted and they pile on top of one another, and that's what prompts you to spiral. Not some unspeakable tragedy that just so happened to occur in tandem with that. So sometimes for me it helps to treat the vulnerabilities as the prompting event rather than adhering to Linehan's rules and sticking and trying to identify a singular prompting event. Now, sometimes the sort of opposite end of the spectrum is also the case, in which life just hits you like a truck and you have one prompting event after the other. Tragedies that amass and accumulate and happen repeatedly over such a short period of time. It's quite anguish-inducing, but it's true. Relegating everything to one single event can sometimes be reductive and as a consequence inaccurate. So I would encourage you to maybe be a bit more creative about that and ask yourself, did the vulnerability serve as the prompting event? Was there a singular prompting event? Maybe there was. Or was there, one agonizing situation after the other? It's not quite as black and white as one identifiable instance. Also, maybe what I would do if I were a DBT therapist, and what I've certainly done for myself, is add a portion to this chain in which I encourage myself to compare the crisis or the harmful behavior to other similarly unpleasant instances. Because sometimes I garner the impression that when you chain a specific event, you're more inclined to dismiss it as an isolated incident rather than an illustration of a broader pattern. When you identify other examples in which you've conducted yourself in a similarly destructive manner, you're more likely to be skillful in the future. You're treating the harmful behavior as a recurring theme rather than simply this anomaly worth leaving in the past. Also, and this is the most important part of the chain analysis, I would say. Although it's a limitation, it's not necessarily inherently a limitation. It's just some context as to why you might not be finding the changes you want to make after simply completing the chain analysis. It's not enough in and of itself. There's something interesting about it, which is that DBT is divided into different units. There's mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness, and I might be missing one. But in any case, the interesting thing about the chain analysis is when you look through Linehan's workbook, it's not under any unit. It's regarded as this vague general skill. And what's important about that is that simply completing a change doesn't improve your life in any meaningful capacity. What it does is it informs you on which skills you need to incorporate. It serves as a as a sort of branching off point, right? So I can give you an example. One time I completed a chain analysis in which the detrimental behavior was this negative, scathing self-talk I was engaging in. And it was repetitive, it was pervasive, it was persistent. And I found that one of the deleterious short-term consequences was that when I'm speaking negatively to myself about myself, it tends to drastically reduce the likelihood of me cultivating new relationships with people. Because when you're constantly telling yourself you're ugly, worthless, unlovable, how are you going to reach out and make friends? You're already assuming they're going to treat you in a certain manner because of the narrative you've developed in your mind. So I told myself that in tandem with that short-term negative consequence, a skillful behavior I can engage in is forming new relationships, being more likely to come up to someone in an environment in which it's appropriate to engage socially and striking up conversation with them. Now, what happens when you tell yourself that you're going to do certain things is that you find that it's oftentimes easier said than done. So this is why I said earlier, when I was talking about that skillful behavior portion of the chain, that it is imperative that you list the certain skills you intend on employing, because the chain analysis on its own is seldom enough. That's a good place in which I could conclude this video. Treat it as a branching off point. Treat it as a blueprint, as a paradigm for how you're going to improve your life, rather than composing it, gaining insight into why you conducted yourself in a certain manner, and not taking any meaningful action in the future. This was my first video. I feel as though it was a lengthy and rambly mess, but I'm still going to post it anyway because I want to get started with this channel and with the potential help it could provide to myself and others. I hope this was insightful for you in some capacity. I'm Ethan, and this has been my first video for finding that what works. Thank you.